So I would like to share with you some of my thinking about the theme, and the subject of my sharing is bridging science and spirituality with philosophy. I would say that most people, even today, believe that a large ditch spreads out between science and spirituality, so that one stands either on one side or on the other. The same horizon viewed from each edge implies two divergent landscapes. The one ends up in nothing but matter. The other leads to a foggy, imaginative vision of paradise. It would be neither useful nor wise to attempt to fuse the views of these two sides. The situation calls for a further exploration concerning the two elements of the theme through examination of their purposes, their methods, their instruments, and their fields of investigation. At a certain point, analyzing and estimating these would bring some inevitable questions upon the role of philosophy in rapport with the development of science and spirituality. Eventually, a summary of the sharing will venture some perspectives as an attempt of looking towards the future. The word science indicates several meanings. Generally speaking, it is equivalent to theoretical knowledge and the practical know-how. In more specific cases, and due to diversifications, it may mean a set of knowledge and information about a defined subject or about a specific sphere. For example, physics which studies matter, its constituents, characteristics, behavior, etc., is part of science, as well as geology, which studies the planet Earth and its evolution. In this talk, the term science is used in its general meaning. The word spirituality indicates the ways of thinking and practices aiming at getting nearer to the spirit that is considered as the essence of life. These practices do not necessarily have connection with a specific religion, as long as universal moral or ethics is respected and applied. In that trend of meaning, I dare to say that a commonly religious person may not necessarily be a spiritual one, and the spiritual person logically would opt for freedom of thought rather than remaining bound to a set of beliefs, hence his independence towards religions. Science aims at gaining knowledge. Since the latter seems infinite, science diversifies itself in more and more sophisticated forms of disciplines. This movement seems unavoidable. Increase the amount of knowledge with innumerable technical details cannot but result in more and more academic disciplines in order to cover more and more domains of knowledge. In ancient times, and up to a quite recent period, one could have been at the same time a physicist, a physician, an astronomer, an alchemist or chemist, etc. This was the case of many well-known names in history, such as Aristotle, Descartes, Newton, etc. Nowadays, some disciplines have to be explained as to their definition in order to give a slightest clue to them. In its over-diversification, science certainly would gain understanding of its purpose in clarifying the process and the orientation of its own development. Yet, while operating and gaining more knowledge, Science fundamentally keeps its original purpose, that of understanding how nature proceeds. It means how things have turned out to be what they are, or rather, what they appear to be. Spirituality, instead of increasing knowledge, and through its various practices, tends to strip off the mind of what is material bound in order to ease its approaching the core of life, the universal, the ultimate, or the reality. In its action, it does not abstain from referring to scientific discoveries. This is to be reminded. This constitutes one of the main divergences of attitude between traditional religions and genuine spirituality. That is, the non-rejection of facts and the spirit of exploration into the unknown. The methods of science and of those of spirituality differ little. Indeed, a great similarity links them together up to the moment of appraising the results. Science, as well as the spirituality, proceeds through 1. Setting a pre-hypothesis, 2. Observing the first step, which is also the first step of learning. Perception needs accuracy to make the data exploitable. 3. Recording follows observation. It needs also accuracy. Integrity constitutes the required condition. The results of the perception should not be distorted because they will act as a sound basis for proceeding work. 4. Reasoning by applying sound foundation towards confirming pre-hypothesis or speculating a new hypothesis. The process needs rigor in reasoning. 5. Testing. Inventiveness within integrity helps setting proper experimentation. 6. Counter-reasoning based on criticizing, based on contradictory reasoning and refutation. Integrity, intellectual honesty, not trying to match hypotheses with observed facts in order to comply with one's own hypothesis. This I cannot comment more because it is already printed. Now the 7th point, where science and spirituality diverge. 7, it is appraising of results, meaning when we estimate the result. 8-point tentative conclusion. All conclusions are always temporary. And 9, transferring the levels from physical particular observations to intellectual general concepts, meaning the making of laws. In the reasoning process, many techniques are used. We can already know about deduction. Deduction proceeds from the general to the particulars. It is explained by logicians in a very complex way. I.K. Temne has the merit of explicitly and successfully expounding it while explaining it in the context of the functioning of the mind. Studying his illuminating commentaries on the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the science of yoga, one can identify deduction under the term of vitarka. Syllogism is a specific form of deduction, but often considered as a lesser form, and indeed, it is a lesser form because it can lead to some hazardous conclusion. First example, humans are selfish. Tom is a human, so Tom is selfish. I hope nobody is called Tom here. You can put any name you want. Humans are selfish. Kim-Dieu is a human, so Kim-Dieu is selfish. Same. You put Tom, Mr. Smith, Mr. Brown, same. Now more hazardous, we will find dogs have tails. My turtle in my garden has a tail. so my turtle is a dog. You cannot accept it, neither me. On the other hand, induction proceeds from the particulars to the universal. Induction was approached in diverse manners by logicians also, without much clarity and without much help for laymen as us. Still here, Temni gave the benefit to laymen by casting insight into the technique, by clarifying the term vichara. Example, bamboos are vertical, trees are vertical, bamboos and trees indicate verticality. Now in passing in the larger scale, vichara constitutes the core of the teaching of Ramana Maharshi, the seer of Arunachala. The pair deduction and induction forms the main modus operandi of the process of reasoning. Yet, analogy constitutes another form of reasoning advocated by Madame Blavatsky. The three, deduction, induction, and analogy, do not form yet the set of thinking process. Let us come back to this later. Methods of science and spirituality follow the similitude until the estimation of results, at the appraising of results. The discrepancy lies in the factor of time. Time is a very big factor. Indeed, for science, the time to reach a possible estimation of results may be feasible for human life, not so for spirituality. An example for science and for spirituality can illustrate this discrepancy. Let's consider the hypothesis of morphogenetic field by Rupert Sheldrake. By the way, Rupert Sheldrake was invited to the Congress, but he could not come due to another commitment elsewhere, which takes place at the same time. Coming back to the hypothesis of reincarnation in spirituality, in the other hand, the hypothesis accepted by Eastern religious traditions. Sheldrake's morphogenetic field, despite rejection from the orthodox scientist community, can be testified by many experiments. It is appreciated by the avant-garde scientists and thinkers. In parallel, the spiritual thesis of reincarnation, having been accepted by most people in the Eastern world, still remains to be proved. This time factor causes major difficulty, if not impossibility, for spirituality to estimate the results so that conclusion, even temporary, can be drawn. Science and spirituality do use a common instrument for investigation, the mind. Nonetheless, science, using the mind, invents other instruments to better fit to the material field of investigation. The most evident examples can be quoted with the invention of telescopes and microscopes, which prolong and increase the capacity of human vision in the infinite, in the infinitely great and the infinitesimal. Furthermore, science, helped by technology, its progeny, continues to grow faster and faster in technoscience. Likewise, the science of space incessantly and tremendously influences life on Earth with miniaturization and utilization of newly synthesized and composite materials. Spirituality, although using the mind, does not invent technologies to investigate. The main reason lies in the inadequacy with the field of investigation. This leads to the question of the field. Yet, before going to the question of the field, let us consider the instrument commonly used by both science and spirituality, I mean the mind. Rigorous exploration of the mind led to the discovery that the methods of science and those of spirituality fundamentally do not differ very much up to a certain moment. This exploration certifies to one of the extraordinary capacities of consciousness, that of observing and seeing how a dual mind works. Indeed, in fragmenting its own field, the mind applies dichotomy to anything in its content. One can first wonder why science and spirituality should oppose to each other. Is it not because the concrete mind cannot regard both differently as mere opposites? Why is it so? Is it not that the mind, as an instrument of measure, has been tainted itself by its particulars, just as lens, specifically colored, is tainted, so that anything the mind observes gets tainted with the same color? Thus, the dualistic trend of the mind lets duality get into its view, so that always there is one and there is the other. Diverted by its dualistic trend, the mind itself cannot see itself. One can recall the well-known Chan or Zen koan, where the master asked the disciple to seize his own hand with the same hand. Try to do it. Then some serious questions arise as a consequence. First, how can the instrument see itself as an instrument? Second, what observes the duality of the mind? These two questions, very important, can be kept for later examination. Now concerning the fields of investigation. Science deals with the field of matter, which becomes wider and wider simultaneously with the progress made by science during the investigation. The knowledge about matter has evolved so much from the ancient atomist theory to the present speculations. One can call this field the objective world, the outer world by opposition to this part called the inner world or subjective world. It is opposite to this objective world according to the dualistic mind. There are two worlds, the outer and the inner. But what is it? It composes all the material things woven together into a complex network, this objective world. So this objective world comprises all material things woven together into a complex network, visible or invisible, nevertheless possible of being tracked. Spirituality, through observation of both inner and outer world, investigates principally the inner world. That occurs in both worlds pertains to the world of phenomena, meaning inside and outside, all we can observe, they are all phenomena. Consequently, observation of both worlds applies to the phenomenal appearance of things, of objects, of events, of people, but not observation of things themselves, so that the things themselves and the things seen by us. Here, more serious questions arise. Number 3, in continuity with those already asked. How can science operate to reach things, objects, events themselves, and not only their appearances? Number 4, How can science, through observation of appearances of things, speculate on the true ontological nature of these? 5. Dealing with the so-called inner world. How to be certain of things and events one observes? We see things, we can describe things, but who will say that they are true things with their true nature and not just appearances? So 6, consequently, the key word of both science and spirituality seems to be uncertainty. Meaning we see things, we describe them, but we are not sure that the things we see are things in themselves, in their true nature, in their ontological nature. Moreover, the world in which we live in is one. Its dichotomization into two separate parts is due to this dualistic mind. It can be soundly presumed that as long as the mind does not overcome this aspect, it will continue to adduce dualistically perceived results as erroneous input for thinking. Since the world is one, the field of investigation is one. What is the field? Is it not the whole existence, the whole manifestation, as we call it in Theosophy? Science investigates it, tries to know more and deeper about it. Spirituality can do the same with similar methods and more. It can benefit from the knowledge reaped by science. But still, science, with its knowledge of the field, is incapable to offer a clear insight into the field. One can here evoke the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. I would make a note that this quotation I have arranged to strip out of it all the names of the characters, etc., in the story to make the quotation more accessible. The story says in the Bhagavad Gita, in the 13th chapter, about the field. Disciples Arjuna asked the master, expressing his ardent desire. He says, matter or Prakriti and spirit, Purusha, the field and the knower of the field, knowledge and the object of knowledge. I ardently desire to learn about them. The spiritual instructor, Krishna, answered, this body is called the field. That knows the field is called by the seers the knower of the field. The knowledge of the field, together with the knowledge of the knower of the field, constitutes the true illumination and the only wisdom. Since the spirit, Purusha, is the knower of the field of existence, which is matter, another question arises. 7. Who, or rather, what knows both the field and the knower of the field? Who or what? This question is the impossible question. It cannot be answered. Who, or rather, what knows both the field and the knower of the field? It is said that mathematics is to provide conceptual evidence of scientific observation. Can't philosophy then be considered as a step towards spirituality? Exploring the nature of mind by using the mind has been compared to the act of cutting a diamond with a diamond. All the thinking, reasoning, estimating, etc. pertain to philosophy. How can one live without thinking, without reasoning, without discerning? In other words, how can one live without philosophy? Those actions define and characterize a human being through the use of the mind. When one is attempting to understand science and spirituality, when one is trying to find their relations, thinking is in movement. Philosophy cannot be discarded. Now thinking operates on different levels. Thinking in philosophy is slightly different from thinking in how to solve a problem of a material order. When one tries to solve a problem of material order, the examination of the problem engages a large proportion of analysis. In analytical function holds a lesser part in philosophical thinking, in which the synthetic and intuitive function would prevail. Philosophy does not and is not meant to solve contingencies or trivialities. Its domain of action belongs to the immense and yet subtle sphere of life and death, and still more. One of my French intellectual guides, a friend from the 16th century, Montaigne, advised, to philosophize is to learn to die in a way. Philosophie, c'est apprendre à mourir un peu. Indeed, thinking consistently about life is part of self-education and entirely education of the mind. Thus thinking about life, meaning philosophizing, may result in understanding of the great life, which includes life and death, the significance of life, the value of moral, the task of a human in his community, etc., and, inexhaustibly, all subjects of essential order. Like science, genuine philosophy does not take a stand, but instead it refers to reasoning. The intellectual neutral attitude amounts to a pose which resembles skepticism. When it is sound, skepticism acts like liberating doubt, the doubt which frees and liberates. The mind walked away from belief and remains unbound. We shall revert to the notion of unbound mind a little bit further. To this point, two other questions legitimately arise. 8. Can one learn philosophy? Because it is so interesting, one likes to learn philosophy. The answer was already given by Immanuel Kant. One cannot learn philosophy. The only thing one can do is to philosophize, meaning to think and to reason. The 9th question runs like, can philosophy be just speculative? Meaning we think, elaborate theories, and etc. Can it be like that? The answer is quite obvious, no. Philosophy can't be just speculative. Whatever the term philosophy may mean, love of wisdom by Pythagoras, or wisdom of love by Blavatsky according to Theosophists, or according to Heidegger, according to academics, the wisdom and the love is there to prompt to comply with the two, meaning with wisdom and with love, in thinking, in speech, in action. That is philosophy which made Rabelais, another friend of mine, the French freethinker, predecessor of Montaigne, say, "Science without conscience is the ruin of the soul. Science sans conscience n'est que ruine de l'âme." This indubitably leads to the notion of ethics. Ethics is a very well-known notion for Theosophists. The more we use the word, the more we have to think about it and on it deeply. It mentions above that the required condition of the methods are accuracy, integrity, rigor of reasoning, and inventiveness. All these are of spiritual nature, allying ability, shrewdness, and moral demand. Moral demand particularly interests us here. Not this type of narrow moral to be applied in order to have a good management of a community's life. Ethics is neither the goodwill of utilitarian positivism expressed in the motto, "The greatest happiness for the greatest number of people." It is not enough. It is good. It is very good. It is not enough. And eventually, the application of this motto would end up in the worshipping of humanity, as did the original leader of positivism, Auguste Comte. He has founded his own religion, then it did not last. Ethics, being the foundation of spirituality, stands at the stage of intention and motivation. A scientist may have the intention to search for more knowledge in order to improve human conditions. Another scientist can be motivated just by the race to get a reward, the Nobel Prize, for example. The difference between the two is of an ethical order. A physicist who explores matter to know more about its behavior in order to understand how things proceed, and while doing so, trying to get a clue on the concept of the ultimate origin, is a spiritual person without being formally named as such. Ethics not only stands for the motivation, it also determines one's attitude towards life. As life is always surprising, it demands a great deal of trust and inventiveness. This dynamism in life is no different from awareness or attention. Here one can revert to the question, how can the mind as an instrument see itself as an instrument? The answer may be given, it can't. Yet, there is a seeing as a witness. When awareness is present, to the inquiry, who is observing, what is watching in observation, one can recall the answer of Jiddu Krishnamurti, who said, awareness is intelligence in action. Earlier in this sharing, it was said that the mind has been conditioned by duality. Here the action of intelligence, meaning awareness, dissolves duality. More clearly, duality disappears when intelligence is at work. It was mentioned also earlier that deduction, induction, analogy, the three do not suffice to the thinking process. Indeed, in some places of her secret doctrine, HPB mentioned the two truths, Paramartha Satya, or absolute ultimate truth, and Samvriti Satya, relative or conventional truth. These two notions were employed already by the seer, the greatest thinker of humanity so far found, Nagarjuna, the great philosopher of the 2nd century. His the unsurpassable philosopher. He advocates that everything that exists is ultimately empty of any intrinsic nature, but does exist conventionally by relationship with the others. One may assume that things exist only through their mutual relationships, meaning that there cannot be a separate thing existing by itself independently from everything. You see a flower because the flower appears to you and you are there in rapport with the flower. The friends are there, they are in rapport. So you exist because of this relationship. You cannot exist alone in the universe. It is an absurdity according to Nagarjuna's thinking. The technique of Nagarjuna consists of refutation and negation up to the point where there is impossible to go further, because the mind is stripped of any argumentation, and thus it becomes still. The process is from Madhyamaka philosophy, more recently used by Jiddu Krishnamurti under the form of dialogue. Somebody may ask me the question, why Madhyamaka and not Madhyamika? I have been explained by a Sanskritist that Madhyamaka is the doctrine and the Madhyamika is the follower of the doctrine. One may make an analogy between the stillness of mind with the state of emptiness, shunyata, from Madhyamaka of Nagarjuna, elsewhere known as dialectics. And according to the sixth patriarch of Chinese Chan Buddhism, Weneng, elsewhere known in Japanese as Eno, wisdom is a consequence of emptiness. I recommend you to read the Sutra of Le Sutra de l'Estrade, or the Sutra on the Stage. It is famous. One can again presume that shunyata first sounds to be the ultimate of all things. Everything is in itself emptiness, and each one begins its existence only in relationship with things in its surroundings. Venturing a supposition, one can say that the three aspects, vichara, madhyamaka, and shunyata, may be respectively considered as the root showed, always moving towards more and more general vichara, the walking out of one's own path through reasoning up the stillness of mind, madhyamaka, and the goal, shunyata. Shunyata is the goal, the guide, and the wisdom itself. Science aims at gaining knowledge and understanding of how nature proceeds so that things have turned out to be what they appear now. Spirituality aims at approaching the core of life, the ultimate. Both use similar methods up to the extent of the limits of science, which is the outer objective manifested world. Spirituality continues to explore the inner part of the field. None of them can reach the ontological nature of things, meaning things as they are, in its truth. So the questions raised lead to a common situation for both: uncertainty. Science and spirituality, neither one nor the other can be sure of anything. And it is the ultimate humility of a researcher. Keeping this uncertainty in mind, science and spirituality can continue using the same method, deduction, induction, analogy, etc., and explore further with critics, refutation, and negation. Yet, to touch the frontier of reasoning with impossible question, as we have mentioned, what, who, or what is beyond the field and the know of the field. So yet to touch the frontier of reasoning with impossible development. No, sorry. I am in pain of my own papers. Just sorry. It would not happen with the Queen of England, because the Queen of England has everything done by the others. Okay, I have the small font. In summary, so keeping this uncertainty in mind, science and spirituality can continue using the same methods, deduction, induction, analogy, etc., and explore further with critics, refutation, and negation. Yet to touch the frontier of reasoning with the impossible question, what knows both the manifested world, the field, and the knower of the field, the mind gets to the point beyond all possible reputation. Then, this question once asked leads the inquirer out of the domain of science. Furthermore, the daring scientist who ventures to ask this is a spiritual scientist. Reasoning, questioning, asking fundamental questions pertains to the domain of philosophy. A scientist cannot abstain from philosophy. Otherwise, he would be a technician of science, dealing with the grossest material level of matter with a vision limited by this level. Science would benefit much by letting itself penetrated by philosophy, because philosophy would guide science from its interest of knowing to the concern of the meaning of the investigation, the concern for life and truth. Here again, pondering over these two fundamental issues, life and truth, necessarily induces one to explore the question of ethics already schemed through earlier. Being bound to the phenomenal world, science, reaching perhaps a wide range of knowledge, would not move further in comprehension of life without acceptance of the concomitant process of philosophy. Science will always have a task and a role in the destiny, dharma of the mind. Spirituality is concerned with the essence of life and its ultimate origin. Philosophy brings completion by offering the complementary note, which is the search for truth. Truth is that is, sat in the motto of the Theosophical Society. To venture a speculation, that is may be the last step prior to the ultimate. It is also shunyata, the state in which only one is possible. That is the true wisdom. One can presume that the world may survive without religions, but it will perish without spirituality. The last question can be asked: how can one think to get understanding of life? Should one be a learned person to come through expertise? You have guessed the answer. If one counted on expertise to approach life, one is ahead towards confusion. Is there a deadlock here? Not at all. Life is moving forward like an irresistible stream, flowing from the ultimate. And the answer was given by the Chinese seer of the 6th, 7th century. By his reply to his audience, and I terminate my sharing with this quotation, "I am not a learned man. My thinking proceeds from the unique."